So we're going to be talking about blockchain today. So I guess I want to just ask, how many people have heard of something called the Gartner hype cycle? Okay, so some of you have. Some years ago, an analyst at Gartner came up with this curve that sort of tracks the level of hype behind a new technology. And when a new technology is introduced, this person noticed that there's very often a sharp spike in excitement about the new technology. It's going to change the world. That is frequently accompanied by or followed by what he called the trough of disillusionment, where people realize that it's probably a little harder than people thought it was, and maybe the use cases aren't quite mature yet. Eventually, people figure it out, and then there's this upward, what they call the slope of opportunity, I think, and then the plateau of productivity. So as new technologies emerge, they go through this hype cycle. In the case of blockchain, there was an anomaly, and that anomaly was Bitcoin, cryptocurrency. And cryptocurrency has been so pervasive and so successful that a lot of people actually conflate cryptocurrency with blockchain. In fact, cryptocurrency is one very prominent use case for blockchain technology, but it's not the only one. In fact, there are many other use cases, and I think what we're seeing now is a number of forces are coming together to take us from that trough of disillusionment to a place where we're actually seeing these real world use cases emerge. So what I want to do today is talk about what blockchain is. I want to try to articulate that at a high level in terms that I think everybody can understand. And then to explore some real world use cases that we're working on. The company I'm working with is called Verae. And then explore perhaps some areas where you might identify additional use cases for blockchain based on what you've learned. So I think one of the things that we've noticed is that there are a few trends that are converging. So one of those trends is increasing digitization and removal of friction in sharing information or transmitting information. So especially in the post-COVID world, we've seen the level of digitization accelerate even faster than it had in the past. So as we have more and more information in digital form, it makes more and more sense to record that and share it in ways that improve traceability, transparency, and compliance. The other thing that we've seen is that last word, compliance. We have seen an intensification of compliance requirements, both contractually between private parties who are doing business together, and also from a governmental regulatory perspective. So in the ITAM space, where we've done a lot of work, there's a lot of compliance around data security and sustainability in particular. So those are some of the use cases that we're going to explore with blockchain and we'll be talking about today. So before we go there, I just want to introduce myself briefly. I got started primarily in ERP software in the late 1990s. I spent a couple of years at Microsoft. Following that, I was at SAP for a while, and one of my roles there was to be an evangelist for emerging technologies, including blockchain. My focus with Verae is product strategy. I've done a lot around product strategy, product management, channel management, and go-to-market. So Verae is a blockchain company. We are primarily focused on ITAM, and reverse logistics. In fact, one of our co-founders was one of the two people who invented blockchain back in the early 1990s, Stuart Haber, at Bell Labs. So when they conceived it, they did not conceive of it as a mechanism for digital currency or cryptocurrency. They really perceived it as a way to ensure digital integrity of information. So we're going to walk through what that looks like. So when I describe blockchain, I like to start out with an analogy. I live in southern New Hampshire, and if I buy a home in my neighborhood, there is one single authoritative source for that real estate transaction and all real estate transactions in my county, and it's called the Registry of Deeds. So there is a building. If you go into that building, you'll see rows and rows of bookshelves with sequentially numbered books. If you open up one of those books, you will see page numbers, sequentially ordered pages. And when someone buys or sells a property, the attorneys who are closing on that deal take the transaction to the Registry of Deeds, and it gets recorded in one of those books. And there's some standard data structure involved with that. So they're looking for who is the buyer, who is the seller, what's a description of the property, is there a lot number or map number that describes that property, there may be a physical description. There could also be some optional information. For example, if there's a mortgage on the property, they're going to be looking for the mortgage holder or the lien holder. So there's a specific data structure that they're looking for. But the key takeaway here in this centralized record keeping model is that there is a single authoritative source. If you want to know who owns a particular piece of real estate in Hillsborough County, New Hampshire, you go to the Registry of Deeds, that's the source. And there are people who make a copy of that and they make it available online, and you can look up that information. But if you really need to know for sure, you're going to go to the single central authority, which is the Registry of Deeds. A blockchain operates on a very different paradigm. And this is what we call widely witnessed events. So I would imagine that my friend James is from New York, I'm from New England. So imagine that I went to him early in the hockey season and I said, I bet you the Bruins are going to outperform the Rangers this season. And
you wish.
If I'm right, you pay me $1,000. If I'm wrong, I will pay you $1,000. Now, if you follow hockey, and unfortunately I am a Bruins fan, you know that at this time of the season, I'm probably going to be looking for a way to weasel out of that bet. Now, the only people in the room at the time were myself and James. I might get forgetful and say, I thought it was $100, right? But if I told him, if I made that bet with James in front of an audience of 100 people or 1,000 people, I'd be in a different position. I'd be in a very difficult position if I wanted to change the facts. So a widely witnessed event is essentially publishing that information to a wide audience. In the case of blockchain technology, that means we have multiple copies of a public ledger. So in this scenario, if we go back to our real estate example, we're taking a real estate transaction and we're sending it off to 1,000 different people, all of whom are managing their own copy of the Registry of Deeds. Okay. So if I want to hack that, if I want to falsify that, there are some mechanisms in place that make that difficult. So remember when I was describing the Registry of Deeds, I talked about sequentially numbered books and sequentially numbered pages. And that makes it a little bit difficult to pull information out, to insert new information, to fake it. In the case of blockchain technology, we have some more advanced techniques for making it very, very difficult to forge information without going back through every preceding transaction and forging that information as well. But the fact that we have, in my example, 1,000 copies of this out there means that if I really do want to go through the work of forging that, I have to find at least 501 of those nodes, those people who are maintaining those copies, who want to collude with me in the fraud. So that makes it very, very difficult to falsify or fake that information. So a blockchain is essentially a public ledger. So what are we putting there? Well, we might post information about IT assets. So I have an HP laptop, and I'm going to pretend, for purposes of this discussion, that the serial number of that laptop is 12345. So if I want to uniquely identify that device out of all the IT devices in the world, I'm going to combine the manufacturer and the serial number, and it's a pretty good bet that's a unique value. Okay, so I can post HP 12345 as my unique identifier to the blockchain, and then I can post any other kind of information associated with that device. So I might, if this is a laptop being returned by a user, I might post the condition of the laptop. I might, if I'm tracking the machine configuration, I might take a snapshot of the machine configuration and post that to the blockchain. And I might also post a URL if there's information that I don't necessarily want to put out in a public location. I can retain that information, retain full control of that information locally. And at Verae, that's how we offer that alternative in a file format that we call a data cube or a database. So I might post a URL to that blockchain as well. Now I might not want to post that publicly. I might not want to make that information publicly available, so I might encrypt it. So here I want to take a little bit of a detour to cryptographic hashing, which is different from encryption per se. But cryptographic hashing essentially means I take some body of data, I run it through a cryptographic hash function, and that gives me a fixed length output of letters and numbers. Okay. So I think you're probably all somewhat familiar with hash values. Hash values have several distinguishing characteristics. And I'll talk about a few of them right now. One of them is that they are deterministic, meaning if I take a body of data, let's say War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, and I run it through a specific hash function, it's going to give me a fixed value. If I do it again using the same source data, War and Peace, and the same hash function, I will get the same value every time. So that's called deterministic. It's deterministic. However, if I change just one little thing, if I add a space somewhere in the middle of the novel, or if I add a comma or capitalize a letter that was not capitalized, I'm going to get a completely different value. It will not even be close. So this is important and valuable for several reasons. Number one is I can tell if something has changed. If you give me data and I timestamp it on the blockchain, and I generate a hash value, which is like a digital fingerprint of that data, and I come back and compare a new copy of that data, and it generates the exact same hash value, I can certify it has not changed since the time that I timestamped it against the blockchain. So there is this aspect of immutability that comes from this kind of hash function. The other thing that's valuable here is it allows me to maintain some kind of anonymity around what I'm posting. So I talked before about unique identifiers. In this case, I used a combination of the manufacturer and the serial number to identify my laptop. But what if I don't want to post it out there and sort of tell the world that I have this laptop with this serial number? In this case, I can generate a cryptographic hash of that, based on that unique identifier, and I can use that as my unique identifier on the blockchain. What that means is that if somebody wants to go looking for that serial number, if they have that serial number and they know the hash function that was used, they can create a cryptographic hash and they can go look it up on the blockchain and they can find the record that I posted there. Doesn't mean they can read the data, but it means they can find it. So there's this element of discoverability, which makes the blockchain particularly valuable when we're talking about assets moving from one custodian to another or from one owner to another. So the ITAM space is very helpful. In the ITAM space, it can be useful as well. And then when we talk about reverse logistics, it enables us to essentially tie together records across multiple owners or custodians. So you can see with the combination of hash values and the public blockchain that I can have metadata, I can have encrypted information, or I can have URLs that point to information that's stored off the chain that now can give me far more detail about whatever it is that I'm interested in. In the case of Verae, what we do is we actually store the off-chain data in a file that allows you to selectively share at a very granular level different elements of that. So I'm going to go through some use cases. I'm going to talk about sharing information with regulators, sharing information with customers if you're an ITAM company, sharing information with business partners that you're doing work with, contracting with. The other thing I want to point out about cryptographic hash functions is that they are a one-way proposition. So there is no way for me to begin with the hash value that was generated by War and Peace, and then reverse engineer that to produce War and Peace. I'm never going to be able to take the output of the hash function and figure out what the original source data was. Okay, so that is another important element in this picture. So what does that give us when we have this element of discoverability across multiple parties that are putting their information on the blockchain? It gives us the ability to tie those together and produce a history. And so we use the analogy of a Carfax report. Okay, so if you have multiple parties who are incentivized to share that information, either contractually or through certification program or through, through other means, we would be able to tie that information together into an item history. And this could be anything from machine configuration to who had ownership or control of an item, to what kinds of repairs or replacements were done on the product, and so forth. So I want to talk about a couple of specific use cases here, because these are all real-world use cases that Verae is working on today. So many of you may be familiar with the XZ-Utils backdoor vulnerability that emerged about a year ago. So I have a friend who is the head of cybersecurity at a large financial services firm, and this one scared him to death. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, essentially there was an open source component that is sort of foundational to most Linux implementations, and a state-sponsored actor had gained trust in the open source community, built a backdoor into that such that somebody with the right cryptographic key would have the capability to gain root access to any Linux system that had that component installed, which was most of the Linux systems in the world. So, as the head of cybersecurity at a large financial services company, this scared him to death. Not only because he knows what's going on within his own four walls, but they're also sharing data with marketing companies, data compliance companies, various third parties that they do business with, and they have strict agreements with those partners that say, we need to know that you are protecting this data. And part of that picture now becomes, I need to know what your software stack looks like. And I not only need to know it now, I need to know what updates were installed and when they were installed. So in that scenario, we can take a machine configuration snapshot, timestamp that against the blockchain, and now we have a provable record that is essentially tamper-proof, or Stuart would say tamper-evident. If somebody changes it, you will know that it has changed. So it becomes a way that all of those vendors, all of those subcontractors are able to prove this is the snapshot we took on that day, and we have not altered it since then. So that's one example in the ITAM space. I mentioned that we work a lot in the ITAD space as well. So we're working with EverCycle. We actually just announced our partnership with EverCycle, which offers a circularity platform that gives customers who are shipping IT assets to ITAD companies, it gives them an additional, I'll say a great deal of additional visibility and control over what happens after it leaves the loading dock at your organization. What we're doing is we're actually embedding blockchain into the EverCycle platform so that the user doesn't have to see anything going on in the background at all, but we're able to timestamp those records. So if somebody is taking in a laptop and they, let's say, take a photograph of it, because it's one of the features that EverCycle provides, they're taking a photograph of that, they have some evidence of the condition of that laptop at the time that it was taken in. They can include a function report, they can include a GPS, tracking records from the chain of custody of that device, or all the devices that came from the customer. So that information, timestamped against the blockchain, provides an immutable record of what happened and when it happened. So there's an element of provability there. The other thing that we hear about a lot in the ITAD space in particular, the two big concerns are data security. I want to know that my data was destroyed securely, and I need to know that with absolute certainty. So again, going back to my friend who works at a large financial services firm, He says, well, we have a simple solution to that. Hard drives come in, they never go out. So they have their own on-site shredding. Most companies don't have that kind of infrastructure. Many companies don't, and they're not going to do that, but they want better evidence of what happened to those hard drives. So if you run it through a bit racer or a Blanco, you're going to get a log file that records exactly what happened with that device. As I have seen it, most ITAD companies retain those log files. They need them for audits, and yet they don't have a real clear, unbreakable chain of preserving those and linking them to the records. So essentially, there's an auditor coming in and spot checking those records. If we timestamp those on the blockchain, they're discoverable, and we essentially have a drill down capability to get to those log files, and so does the customer. And that's especially valuable because most customers these days are still relying on, you know, a piece of paper that came out of a laser printer that says certificate of data destruction. And that doesn't necessarily have a whole lot of real world value, but the blockchain does. The other thing that we hear about a lot in the ITAD space is sustainability. So I want to know what happened to those devices, where did they go? And so the ability to sort of track the downstream activity on a device or the materials that emerge from that device is also very important and is becoming more important. So a couple of weeks ago, my colleague James and I attended a meeting in Dallas of Series Technical Advisory Committee on ESG standards. So they're coming up with a new standard around ESG reporting, and one of the elements of that standard has to do with reporting essentially the environmental benefits of disposing of assets responsibly. So one of the elements that they want to report is greenhouse gas emissions avoided. Okay. Now, there's a challenge here, because if I buy a new laptop and I use it for 3 years, and then I decide to replace it, and I send it over to an ITAD, and they're going to refurbish it, resell it, I can claim credit for, let's say, not having that end up in a landfill. I can claim some credit in my ESG report for responsibly handling the disposal or decommissioning of that asset. But what about the next person who gets it? What if that next person keeps it for 3 weeks and then does the same thing, and they say, I just saved a 3-year-old laptop from the landfill? That's essentially, we're double counting credit on that. So one of the things that they're grappling with is, how do we avoid when do we recognize the value of certain activities in that decommissioning process, and how do we avoid double counting? There are multiple parties involved. How do we avoid double counting? Now you can imagine if we post it on the blockchain and that information is discoverable, I can now report who claimed credit for what in that process. If we think about cryptocurrency, this is called the double spending problem. It is, I spend a Bitcoin, and then quick, before word gets around to all of the nodes, I try to spend it again. So Bitcoin has some very elaborate mechanisms for preventing double spending. In this case, we don't actually need to prevent double spending, we just need to detect it. So this is another real-world use case where we can detect credit being taken twice for the same activity. And a very similar scenario happens with donated assets. So I spoke to somebody who works for a large organization that handles donated corporate IT assets. And they are aggregating donated assets, and then they are sending them downstream to statewide organizations, which may then send them to local organizations, which may then put them in the hands of individual users. So these are laptops that are going to schools or after-school programs and things like that. The problem is that many of these are supplemented by grant programs, like federal funds, things like that, and they want reports. So the grantors want to know, how many laptops did you donate? The problem is that the parent organization that donates it to a state level organization says we donated 1 laptop. That organization then passes it on to a local organization that says we donated 1 laptop. The local organization donates it to an end user who needs it and said we donated 1 laptop. But we didn't donate 3 laptops, we donated 1. So this is a reporting problem that this particular organization has that again can be resolved by blockchain, because we can tie those records together and easily identify that those are one and the same laptop. The last thing I'm going to talk about is compliance, because the compliance is a theme that runs through all of these things. So I've talked about it a little bit in the ITAD space, that there are organizations that need to know with certainty, and they need that drill down capability to see what happened to my data, what happened to my hard drive. We are also seeing increasingly stringent restrictions on how you can dispose of materials, how you can dispose of assets. And right now, the Global E-Waste Monitor, which is a UN organization, has estimated that global e-waste is approximately 62 billion metric tons as of 2024. They predict that that will increase to 82 billion metric tons by 2030. So we're only responsibly recycling about 22% of the current volume, but the volume is going to go up, and even as we increase the amount that we responsibly recycle, the percentage is going to drop to 20%. Okay, so that's a huge amount of material that has potential toxicity, that's taking up space in landfills, and that really needs to be handled in a more responsible way. Governments understand this, regulators understand this, and private companies understand this, and they want to do something about it. So the ability to track this and to track it in a way that is provable and trustworthy is critically important. So that's what we're seeing in the meeting on ESG standards a couple of weeks ago. It's what we're seeing really with all of the folks that we're talking to in corporate IT departments and in ITAD companies is compliance is tightening. Now is the time when we need to have these kinds of mechanisms in place so that we can handle this stuff well. So I want to, having given you those what are very real world use cases that we're working on today, I want to kind of summarize some of the characteristics of blockchain as it applies in the ITAM space. And then I have a couple of slides where I'm going to go through some categories of potential other use cases. And I'm saying this because I think there's a host of use cases that we really haven't explored yet. And if you see something in here that resonates with you, we would love to hear about it. We'd love to talk to you about how we can potentially help you solve some of your challenges. So the first thing about blockchain is it is decentralized. So if we go back to this question about the Global E-Waste Monitor, the global e-waste problem, how do we tackle that? So if their goal is to get to 60% responsibly recycled, how do we even begin that process? One way to do that would be to create a massive monolithic database that catalogs every IT device in existence. Not going to happen, right? Nobody wants to share that information. It's not going to work. It's not going to happen. Decentralized technologies, blockchain being a peer-to-peer technology, provide a good workable answer to that problem. It's private and potentially shareable. So again, in the case of Verae's technology, it's private and very, very selectively shareable at a granular level. I talked to one ITAD that said, well, we just decommissioned a data center. We pulled a bunch of very high-end graphics cards out of there, and I don't really want to tell the world that I have right now probably half the world's inventory of that high-end graphics card. I'd like to sell it in dribs and drabs and not flood the market with what is an otherwise valuable commodity. Blockchain provides immutable records, which is to say, once it's there, You can change it, but everybody's going to see it has been changed. So this gets down to provability, and I think this is one of those things where we take the digitization of information, the easy exchange of information, and immutability, and what that gives us is more and more companies feel very justified in saying, I'm glad to know that your machine configurations do not include this vulnerability from XEUtils, but I need you to prove it to me. So being able to prove what happened is important. It's persistent, meaning that which gets posted on the blockchain lives forever on the blockchain. As long as there are nodes out there hosting that blockchain, it persists. So if you post it there and then you as a company cease to exist, anything you stored off-chain might cease to exist, but what you post on there will persist, despite your company going out of business. And finally, it's efficient. What we're doing, again, what we're doing with EverCycle is completely transparent to the end user. They don't even know it's there, but they're able to take in a laptop, click the, enter whatever attributes they need to enter about the laptop, click the save button, and in the background, that's going out and posting to the blockchain, and it's returning a hash value receipt to EverCycle, so that is available to the user, and they can prove that that information is not changed. So the next 3 slides, I want to talk about a couple of scenarios. And this is intended to kind of get your creative juices flowing, to get you thinking about some other scenarios where blockchain could apply in the ITAM space. So one area is asset identification and ownership. And when you think about, I need to know who owns this particular tablet device, well, probably not, because it's not that important or that valuable. But what about quantum computing? There was a day when if you worked at in a university computer lab, people were reserving blocks of this many minutes of time on the computer. Quantum computers, and again, I have a friend who's toured the facility, IBM's facility, and has seen it up close. I think they're around $100 million starting price, plus I'm sure quite an intense need for people to operate the thing and maintain it. If you've heard of NFTs, non-fungible tokens, this is something that's made available via blockchain that allows you to own an intangible asset. Can you imagine potentially buying a timeshare in a quantum computer? Blockchain can do that for you, okay? Asset lifecycle events, we've talked about that a little bit in the ITAM space in particular. We've talked about things like the repair history, firmware updates, component replacements, access control logs if you wanted to timestamp logs for audit purposes and be able to prove that those cannot have been altered. Blockchain would be very well suited to do that. Again, talked about compliance and security, smart contracts, tamper-proof evidence, encryption hashes. Encryption hashes can be useful for linking and authenticating information that's stored in multiple places. So if you're using hashes rather than the original information, you're able to link information together without revealing the primary key, so to speak. There are a lot of blockchain companies that are focused in the supply chain space. In fact, very, very early on was looking at cobalt, and there's some of these materials that companies want to know that these things were ethically sourced. In fact, we're talking to a large contract manufacturer right now because they have a very keen interest in understanding the source and the provenance of the materials that are coming into their organization. Shipping and logistics, there's been considerable effort to try to introduce blockchain to speed customs. Materials to speed the flow of items through through ports of entry. Many of those have encountered some resistance because people are very stuck in their ways and don't want to change. So IBM and Maersk, for example, had a very big blockchain effort that did not ultimately succeed. And then certification and compliance records. This mentions security environmental standards. We've also had extensive discussions around credentialing and the issuance of professional credentials, the tracking of professional credentials, and at times the revocation of professional credentials. That we can track those in the supply chain, people can maintain those records, and then we can authenticate those. And then the last one, again, I talked about IT asset disposition because I think this is one of our primary areas of focus. Things like documenting the chain of custody and timestamping that against the blockchain, data destruction, and then recycling and sustainability, verifying compliance with the various environmental regulations, which are becoming more and more intensive. I will also mention that ITAM companies that we've spoken to say that the audit process is one of the things that keeps them up at night. So preparing for an audit and then making sure that they successfully pass an audit without findings is a pretty intensive process, and many ITAM companies have that one person in the organization who knows where everything is and knows how to do that, and they are loath to fire that person or to do anything that would prevent them from staying on. So blockchain and the sort of digitization and the tracking of this information gives us a level of auditability and eases the audit process and speeds the audit process in ways that currently are not possible. So I'm going to skip over this one. I simply want to say there are various kinds of blockchains. There are permission-based blockchains. So if you had a consortium that was involved with an initiative where they did not want unauthorized parties outside the blockchain to post to it, you could have a permission-based blockchain. You could have a permission-less blockchain that allows anyone to post. You can also store on-chain, you can store off-chain. Again, a hybrid model that has off-chain storage, such as a file system or a database, gives you, as a user, gives you ultimate control over that data. So, generally speaking, we see this as upstream, downstream traceability, enhanced asset tracking, automated compliance, the ability to capture information, store it, timestamp it, prove it, and then make it discoverable across multiple custodians or owners. So this creates efficiency and ensures authenticity. In the blockchain space, we often talk about a trustless environment, and that's, we think that is more and more where the world is going. When we talk about auditors who are spot checking information, there's still an element of trust. We're spot checking, and we're trusting that if we spot check and things work out well, that generally you're doing a good job handling the rest of the data that you have. In a trustless environment, you don't have to trust, you have the proof, and blockchain provides that. So some of the considerations is as you're thinking about a blockchain solution, scalability and efficiency. And I mention this one because like many early stage technologies, there's I say early stage, blockchain's been around since the 1990s. But in terms of adoption and tool sets that are available, there's still a bit of a wild west. You want scalability and efficiency. So you want to look for technologies that can handle very, very high transaction volumes. You also want things that have a robust API and it can integrate well with your existing ITAM systems. There are blockchains that, there is blockchain technology that is platform based. That is, so if you look at AWS, they have a blockchain platform on the AWS cloud. There are some blockchain companies or technologies that operate on the Ethereum blockchain or on the Bitcoin blockchain. In the case of Verae, it's choose your blockchain. So we're not a platform, we are platform agnostic. Regulatory and compliance issues are an interesting one. I think this is rapidly evolving. I think, like many things, legislators are several steps behind. Legislators and regulators are a few steps behind the private sector and organizations like Siri and Easterwards and others who understand technology, they understand how to apply it, they understand how to leverage it. So as this matures, as we see more and more use cases roll out in the real world, I think that from a regulatory compliance perspective, we're going to see more recognition of the value that blockchain adds to the picture. And then finally, cost and implementation hurdles. The way I have described blockchain, I guess it sounds sort of simple, like many things. It isn't. The devil's in the details, and there is a great deal of complexity potentially to it. We take that complexity out, but I guess this is the classic build versus buy question. And if you find yourself asking that question, we would certainly love to talk to you. So with that, I'll take any questions or comments. If people have ideas that you'd like to discuss about how blockchain might apply in your context. Yes?
Yeah, I've got a question for you. When it's moving from custodian to custodian from a chain of custody perspective, in order to post to the chain, does that custodian, each custodian has to have the platform for posting ability?
Yes, that could be a website. It could be a mobile phone app. So I would say what's more important is that they have to have the incentive to do it. Okay, so, and I'll give you an example, because when we were talking reverse logistics a couple of weeks ago, and at the reverse logistics conference here in Vegas, I think.
Yeah.
And one of the points we heard was, this phone used to be something that somebody would buy and then maybe sell it secondhand, but the world is changing. This phone will typically now have 3 or more owners in its lifetime. So if you are Samsung or Apple or some other OEM, you want to know about that. You want to know who the next owner is, and you want to understand a little bit about them so that you can market to them, and so that you can have some control over your brand. Because although that didn't necessarily pass through Samsung's hands when it went from its previous owner to me, it may still reflect on their brand. So they want to have some control over the brand, and they want to know who's buying it. They want to be able to market to those people, and they also understand that the person who buys the latest version of the iPhone is not the person who buys the 3-year-old iPhone or the 5-year-old iPhone. So they want to know who those owners are. How do you do that if people are going down to the local cell phone, the strip mall cell phone place and buying that device? Well, I could incentivize, I could ask them to share data by pushing that data upstream to me. Or I could just say, look, we have an agreed upon format and a way to register it, so to speak, with the blockchain. And I can then discover that information and pull in information about it. So I need to incentivize that behavior. So whether that's incentivizing the local shop owner or incentivizing the person who bought it by saying, hey, I've got an offer for you. You get $20 credit on the Google Play Store or the App Store. If you register your device, then you've got some mechanism for doing that. In a corporate context, I think a lot of that happens with contractual agreements. So how do you, in a donation context, I talked about the donation example, the laptop that's flowing downstream through several organizations. Again, I think that's sort of how do you write the grant language, and how do you say this is what is expected of you, that you will report this information in the following way. And you don't have to tell people it's blockchain. You just say, you go to the website or you upload a CSV file, that then gets posted to the blockchain, and now we have that discoverability across multiple owners.
I would also add that the sequential people that you're talking about, they're all independent actors. They have their own ERP systems or not. I mean, they're all, they have to know each other, like each other, or even trust each other for this to work. Because as long as they have a serialized object, give it some manufacturer serial number, that would be sufficient to link the blockchain records together.
Other questions or comments?
No, go for it.
I don't know.
Oh, it's good.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We will be sticking around. Students from Evercycle and James and myself from Verae will be sticking around for a few minutes. If you want to come talk to us, we'd love to chat. And if you are interested in reaching out, here's my contact information. Please feel free to get in touch. Would love to talk to you. I believe there are also evaluation forms, and so would ask you to please fill out the evaluation form and let us know how you did. All right?
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.